And finally tonight, stories of dishonor for some who died in war. Margaret Warner has our report.
Dover Air Force Base in Delaware receives America's war dead in solemn ceremony, with top brass and presidents paying their respects. But now, after a year-long investigation, the Air Force has acknowledged gross mismanagement of some remains within the base's military mortuary. Lost body parts in 2 instances in 2009, fragments of ankle bone and human tissue of servicemen killed in Afghanistan, and the severing of a dead Marine's arm bone in 2010 to fit him into a dress uniform for viewing without getting the family's consent. Still, the Air Force concluded there had been no violations of law or procedure, and Air Force Chief of Staff General Norton Schwartz yesterday defended the decision to discipline but not fire the 3 senior mortuary officials in charge.
This was not a deliberate act. In my personal view and that of the commanders who exercised authority in this case.
But separately, the Independent Office of Special Counsel criticized the Air Force's conclusions and disciplinary decisions, saying they demonstrated a pattern of failure to acknowledge culpability for wrongdoing relating to the treatment of remains.
And Defense Secretary Leon Panetta has ordered a review, and today his spokesman said he leaves open the possibility for further accountability. For more, we're joined now by Craig Whitlock, national security reporter at The Washington Post. And Craig, thank you for coming back. Let's start with, how did these charges even come to light, even come to be investigated?
Hi, Margaret. The charges came from 3 whistleblowers, each of whom works at Dover Air Force Base at the mortuary. These were embalmers and technicians who've worked there for a number of years. And they filed complaints with a number of agencies, including the Inspector General of the Air Force, with the Department of Defense, and with the Office of Special Counsel. And this happened in about April and May 2009, and that's what 2010, and that's what prompted the investigations.
And what is the major point of disagreement here between the Air Force probe and then the Office of Special Counsel, which seems quite a bit harsher?
It is quite a bit harsher, Margaret. The Air Force, as you noted earlier, investigated these allegations in detail, and while they did find a pattern of quote-unquote gross mismanagement, they found that these individual allegations of missing body parts and improperly handled remains were not a violation of specific rules or procedures, and no one had personally broken any rules. The Office of Special Counsel took strong exception to that. They said this was evidence that the Air Force did not take these allegations seriously enough, that they should have disciplined some of these supervisors more severely, including one who they said had been quote-unquote untruthful to investigators. And the Office of Special Counsel said essentially the Air Force took a very light hand in reacting.
And that's that guy you're talking about, Mr. Keel, was the director of the mortuary.
That's correct.
Now, this seems to be a fast-moving story. What are the latest?
Well, we're reporting on our website very shortly, if we haven't already on my way to the studio, that there were some highly suspect methods for the Air Force mortuary to dispose of some remains at Dover for many years. We're going to report, and Air Force officials have admitted that between 2003 and 2008, that with some body fragments and tissues and parts recovered from the battlefield, that they cremated them and disposed of them in a landfill in Virginia. They did this for the most part without the families being aware. And let me be clear, in each of these cases, these were, war is an ugly business, and it's pretty graphic, and in some cases, bodies weren't left intact, and it takes a while to identify all the remains of the body. And in many cases, the families gave the Air Force permission to dispose of any later found body parts in a dignified and appropriate manner. What they didn't know is that the Air Force would have them cremated and incinerated and then taken to a landfill.
So the fault here is failure to essentially show the proper respect and not meet the family's expectations, or what they had told the family would be done with them.
I think that's right. The families were not aware this was going on. Some families had tried for years to get answers of what had happened, and the Air Force was reluctant to be open about it. But again, let me emphasize that for the military, giving care and respect and dignity and honor to fallen troops and their families, those who were killed in battle is, of the utmost importance in military culture, as well as regulations. So the idea that these remains could be handled in this manner, whether the lost body parts or ultimately ending up in a landfill, I think is pretty shocking to many people in our armed forces and their families.
Now, the special counsel was also very critical of the Air Force for its own timetable for notifying the families. What happened there?
That's correct. This investigation took 18 months or so. The Air Force waited until last weekend to notify 4 families whose service members had body parts that were missing or couldn't be accounted for. The Air Force has given some shifting explanations for why they waited so long. First, General Schwartz, the Chief of Staff, who you heard earlier, said that there were some constraints placed on the Air Force by the Office of Special Counsel that made them wait. Later, he said that it was the Air Force's judgment that they wanted to give all the information to the families in one fell swoop instead of partial reports, and that's why they waited. The Office of Special Counsel was highly critical of this. They said that they had urged the Air Force for months to notify the families, that they should have been notified right away that there were these discrepancies in what happened to their relatives, their fallen relatives.
And briefly, Secretary Panetta has ordered another review. You all have now your findings. Where does this go from here?
We're not sure, and I think there's a lot of questions as to how things were handled at this mortuary and for how many years. Yesterday, General Schwartz couldn't rule out that there had been other incidents where body parts were missing or other improprieties. He said he hoped everything had been fixed and that everything was up to snuff now, but we don't know what happened in prior years or in other cases, and we'll have to wait and see what comes out.
All right. Thank you, Greg. Craig Whitlock of the Washington Post. Thanks much.